Mirëmbrëma. Richard Grenell, shef i inteligjencës në administratën Trump, i dërguar i presidentit Trump për marrëveshjen për bisedimet Kosovë-Serbi, shumë i angazhuar me zhvillimet në Ballkan, sonte për herë të parë është në studion time dhe kam kënaqësinë ta kem në këtë studion në Tiranë. Zoti Grenell, faleminderit.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Zoti Grenell, interesi i parë për publikun shqiptar është, pasi CV-ja ju është mjaft e njohur, me çfarë merret tani Richard Grenell? Çfarë bën?
Well, I'm in the private sector. I am no longer in government. It feels good to be away from government. But I'm trying to continue my work in the Balkans. And what we always envisioned when we were negotiating this Serbia-Kosovo agreement was to have the private sector and job creators come in and help with economic development. I firmly believe, and still believe to this day, that the way we're going to solve these problems is not to sit around a table and talk about political issues, but to create jobs and to find ways to have economic normalizations. That is exactly what President Trump envisioned. He wanted to see Western companies come into this region, but there's always been a perceived conflict. Whether or not there was a conflict, many Western companies, many American companies perceived the region to be in conflict. And so what we were trying to do is solve that. How do you make the countries in the region work more closely together to create jobs and to keep young people here, rather than having young people pick up and move to Germany because they feel like that's their only hope for a better way of life. We want to see people stay in this region, and economic development is the way to do it.
Dy gjëra më bëri përshtypje fakti se ju thatë, zoti Grenell, jam i kënaqur, jam larguar nga qeveria, pra nuk punoj me qeverinë dhe jam i interesuar për zhvillimin ekonomik të Ballkanit. E para, pse jeni i kënaqur që jeni larguar nga qeveria? Po flasim për qeverinë amerikane.
You know, I firmly believe in this Thomas Jefferson principle. You know, we're a young country in America, and we created this idea that Washington, D.C. would be a temporary place, that people, ordinary people, regular people who have worked in business would take a moment away from their lives to join government and to bring these principles. It's a Jeffersonian principle that you pick up, you run for office for a short period of time, and then you go back and you live under the rules that you helped create. Now, Donald Trump, the first time that Donald Trump spent the night in Washington, D.C., was because he was elected president and about to be inaugurated. Think about that. He wasn't a creature of Washington, D.C. He wasn't somebody who was there. Donald Trump actually gave money to Democrats and Republicans for decades as a businessman. He understood that that's what politicians wanted, or for businessmen to support both sides. He was doing that, and then he decided to step up and run for office. He hasn't been a Washington, D.C. politician. We have a lot of people who have been in politics for 40 years, and I think that our view is that that's not good. So it's a long answer to say to you, I'm glad to take a break from government. I've done that my whole life of working in the government, then I go back into the private sector. It gives me a sense of what works, right? I know from the private sector side what government can do and what it shouldn't do.
Pyetja konkrete për Richard Grenell është: Richard Grenell është një politikan, një diplomat apo një biznesmen?
You know, I'm just a kid from Michigan who was born in Michigan and raised in California by two parents. My dad was a car salesman, and my mom worked at the local hospital. And they had 4 kids, and they believed in God, and they believed in a lot of hard work. And we didn't have a lot of money growing up. We didn't know that that was a big deal. I didn't know that you weren't supposed to have a lot of money because we had a lot of love and a lot of great family time. So I'm just a kid from America that believes in the American dream. And I hope I'm never a politician. I don't think I'll ever run for office. I can't imagine that I would automatically do that, but you never know. I mean, God is always in control of your lives, but I don't plan on doing that. In terms of diplomacy, I didn't want to be a full-time career diplomat. I want to solve problems. So to the extent that I can join government and bring some real-world experience and solve problems, that would be the only reason why I joined government, is to solve problems, hopefully do it in a quick way, in a short period of time, and then go home and have a life.
Zoti Grenell, u shpret pak më parë se unë nuk do të kandidoj kurrë për një funksion zyrtar, po a do të pranohet një emrim në një funksion zyrtar? Për qenë më korrekt, për aq sa mendoj unë se mund ta njoh publikun shqiptar. Ata që ju duan prej Donald Trump. Ata që ju urrejnë prej Donald Trump. Shqipëria është shumë e ndarë për sa i përket presidencës Trump. Ndoshta do ju duket çudi, por këtu janë sponsorizuar fushata që Donald Trump mos merrte presidencën kur u zot presidenti i Shtetit Bashkuar të Amerikës. Pra, kam idenë që më shumë është bërë luftë mediatike në Tiranë sesa në Washington, thua se shqiptarët e kishin në dorë se kush duhet shkonte në zyrën e presidentit Shabave. Do të pranonit një emrim, jo zgjedhje, në një funksion tjetër të lartë në administratë, në të ardhmen?
So I have before. I have taken appointments. I certainly would. It depends on what it is. I'm not somebody who just wants anything. I do believe in Donald Trump. I believe in the outsider status. I believe in somebody who brings private sector ideas into the government. So I'm all supportive of Donald Trump. I think that the media completely get him wrong. They don't understand that he was the guy that supported Democrats and Republicans for a long time. He is somebody who wants to get stuff done. He doesn't necessarily think about partisan issues. He doesn't immediately look at an issue and say, well, what's the Republican issue? What should I decide? What should I do? He really thinks about solutions. And I know that that's not his reputation. I'm smart enough to know that the media like to absolutely control him. But I will say this to my friends in the media, and I have many friends in the media. I think they're threatened right now as to what's happening in the real world. People are going to be citizen journalists now. I think social media, especially Twitter, allows us to interact with journalists. We get to have a voice. We get to push out our voice. We don't need an editor to edit us. And politicians and business people, they no longer need to go to these big media companies to get their message out, to tell their story. They can do it directly by going to social media. I think big media companies are threatened by that. They like the control, and it makes sense. Before we had social media, people had to come to the TV stations, they had to go to the newspapers in order to have their voice be heard by the public. Now you don't have to do that. I have over 1 million followers on Twitter, and nobody edits me. Nobody tells me what to say. Nobody says you can't say that. Nobody takes half of my quote. I get to say whatever I want to the public, and the public gets to read it.
Kjo për në Amerikë, por sigurisht nuk e dini, por unë po ju jap një të dhënë të fundit për Shqipërinë. Zoti Grenell, kryeministri shqiptar ka ndërtuar një aplikacion i cili kontrollon çdo pjesëtar të administratës publike nëse i bën ose jo like postimeve të kryeministrit. Dhe nëse jo, largohet nga puna. Ju flisni për Amerikën, ne jetojmë në Ballkan, aq më keq në Shqipëri. A e percepton dot një qytetar i lirë amerikan që thotë unë kam median time, kam rrjetin social, se në një vend të Europës, një pjesëtar i administratës që nuk i bën like kryeministrit largohet nga puna?
Look, I don't know about this app, so I don't want to talk specifically about it because I have never heard this. I don't know about it. But let me say a couple of things that I would have a concern about. I look at America, and I look at the White House press corps, all of the reporters that are covering the White House, and majority of them, by far the majority of them, overwhelming majority of them, are liberal, leftist, woke types who support Joe Biden, support everything he says. I don't believe that that is good for America. I don't believe that we're getting Americans to actually hear both sides of the story. When I grew up, my dad used to say to me, sit and listen to somebody else. Don't silence them, sit and listen. You might learn something. And so I want to always be for a calm but respectful dialogue. And I want you, if you disagree with me, to have your turn to say, I think that you're full of it. And here's why. I never want to silence people from that. But I do think that there's a responsibility that the public has to be able to sit and listen and wait their turn and then give their opinion. Public policy officials, government officials have the responsibility to hear all sides and then make the best judgment.
Edhe një pyetje të fundit për Amerikën para se të kthehemi dhe të flasim për Ballkanin, ku në fakt është interesi kryesor për ditur mendimet tuaja. A beson Richard Grenell në një rikthim të Donald Trump?
I for sure do. I think that Americans do. I think that people are hungry for a Trump economy. I think they're hungry for a Trump foreign policy. Look, we would not have the war in Ukraine if Donald Trump were in the White House. And let me be really clear about this. I spent 2 years as the U.S. ambassador to Germany highlighting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, what some call the Putin pipeline. I didn't think that it was a good idea. And during the Trump administration, we had Trump sanctions on that pipeline. We didn't see a war, and we didn't see huge problems in Europe when we had sanctions on that pipeline. I got criticized, Donald Trump got criticized for being too mean-spirited about that pipeline. They'd say, oh, you keep talking about it, you keep talking about it as a bad thing, and you've got sanctions on it. When the Democrats came into the Senate, they dropped those sanctions. They dropped the Trump sanctions on that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and we saw within months a war in Ukraine because Vladimir Putin saw the dropping of those sanctions on his pipeline as a very weak moment. So I would say to you that the Senate Democrats who dropped those sanctions take responsibility. They should take responsibility for this growing escalation that resulted into a war. And so when people see that and they see the billions of dollars that the Americans are having to pay for this war in Ukraine, I think people are hungry for Donald Trump and a rejection of war. You know, before Donald Trump came into office, the media kept saying he's going to cause World War III. He actually not only did he not cause World War III, he created world peace. No. Arabs and Israelis came together. We didn't have the war in Ukraine. So I would argue that Americans are really hungry for a growing economy and for peace around the world. And I think our NATO allies are hungry for that. I think our Latin allies are hungry for that. Africans want to see that. So I hope that Donald Trump comes back. I will be his biggest cheerleader.
Por Amerikanët mund të thonë është Europa në luftë, nuk është Amerika në luftë. Sa ndikon kjo në zgjedhjet amerikane? Lufta në Ukrainë.
Well, I think the Americans know that this war is taking place in Europe, and we want to see the Europeans step up more, specifically the Germans. I've been very clear. I think President Trump has been clear. I think there's a lot of frustration in America that the Germans aren't doing enough. They talk a big game, but remember the Germans have a budget surplus. They have extra money, and they're still not paying their NATO 2%, and we find that to be unacceptable.
Për NATO-s. Kthehemi në Ballkan. Çfarë e lidh kaq shumë Richard Grenellin me Ballkanin? E vizitoni shpesh.
I'm not sure I don't know the answer to that. How do you explain something that you love? How do you explain something that you respond to? I know this is going to be terribly translated because I don't even know how to quite talk about my love for the Balkans. I came here and I saw a lot of injustice, and I saw hungry people for capitalism and for democracy. all over. And I think that they have been largely ignored by a lot of Americans. And look, I've been very clear. I know it's controversial to say, but I believe this. I don't believe that the Joe Biden White House is paying enough attention to Albania, to Kosovo, to Serbia, to Montenegro, to North Macedonia. I just don't believe that they're paying attention to it. They've somehow shoved this off at the State Department, and we've got some State Department people paying attention, but they're not briefing the president on this. They're not walking into the Oval Office on this. Donald Trump did that. Donald Trump had people that would walk into the Oval Office to talk about the Balkans. He had Balkan leaders into the Oval Office. We don't see that being done.
Kjo është e prekshme dhe mënyrë veçantë gjatë presidencës së Obamës, kur zëvendës presidenti Biden mbulonte Europën, interesi amerikan në Ballkan fatkeqësisht ka qenë minimal. Ju pak më parë më folët për investimet dhe për ekonominë se si mund të ndikojë në normalizimin e raporteve kryesisht ndërmjet Serbisë dhe Kosovës. Nuk e di nëse e dini, zoti Grenell, por investimet amerikane edhe në Shqipëri, fatkeqësisht, në Kosovë, edhe në Serbi, të paktën gjatë kësaj dekade, 12 viteve, janë minimale. Investimet ruse dhe kryesisht investimet kineze, edhe turke në Shqipëri, e dominojnë tregun. Në qoftë si ju mendoni se krizat politike zgjedhen nëpërmjet ekonomisë. Sot, Ballkanin e kontrollon Kina, Rusia dhe Turqia. Ku ishin amerikanët?
Yeah, so I agree. And I have been trying to push back when I was in government and when I was outside of government to say to leaders in the Balkans constantly, reject the Chinese and the Russian offers of investments. Let's move away from those countries and let's have a greater relationship with the United States. So now that I'm totally in the private sector and I'm working with companies and funds to be able to find projects, I've been coming regularly to the Balkans looking for projects to help fund projects that move us forward, not just about making money, but projects that actually make the lives of individuals better. I will just say this, the Kosovo-Serbia Economic Normalization Agreement that I negotiated had some really cool things in it. One of the points was that Kosovo and Serbia agreed that both would move away and diversify their energy sources. Now, for Serbia, that's a big deal because 100% of their energy comes from Russia, and for them to commit to peeling back and having diversified energy sources is a good thing. I see that beginning to happen. I wish it would go faster, but I believe that we are on that path. The private sector needs to continue pushing that.
Vetëm ndërhyrje, këto është interesante kjo që e keni shumë korrekt informacionin që Serbia varet 100% nga energjia ruse dhe një alternativë tjetër mund t'i bënte mirë. Pse jeni i bindur se serbët kanë interes të kenë alternativë tjetër varësie energjie përveç asaj ruse?
Well, because I've had conversations with them, both in government and out of government, to talk about what the future looks like. And energy issues take a very long time, but that's just one example. I'll also say that, I've been public about my frustration with Albin Kurti and the fact that consecutive American governments, administrations, whether it's Obama or Trump or Biden, have tried to work on energy deals in Kosovo to replace the coal plant. There was a recent deal that came up about 6 months ago that would have been great for the people of Kosovo. Cleaner energy, cheaper energy, really 21st century energy issues. And it was rejected by Albin Kurti. So I think that we've got a long way to go. We got to keep pushing, and we got to be able to convince our partners that American investment is a good thing.
Zoti Grenell, Albin Kurti e njoh shumë mirë. Njoh gjithë rritjen e tij politike nga momenti kur ka qenë në burgjet e Serbisë. Albin Kurti ka shumë vështirë të firmos apo të pranojë marrëveshje. Kjo është një gjë e provuar, të cilin edhe ai nuk është se e mohon. Por të kthehemi pak tek argumentet që janë dhënë zotit Kurti në atë kohë. Sa korrekt është pretendimi i një pjesë mirë të opinionit kosovar dhe politik, jo vetëm opinionit publik, se ka pasur një tentativë reale për të ndarë Kosovën. A ka pas realisht një tentativë për të ndarë Kosovën?
So, if you're talking about land swaps, which I think that's what you're referring to, I've never been in a conversation about that. I've been very clear to say that. I've never heard that as an option. I've never talked about it. I certainly never negotiated for it because it wasn't a subject that ever came up. I have heard people say that previous American officials had brought that up. Again, I don't know of that, and certainly as U.S. Ambassador to Germany, I know Chancellor Merkel had always said to me, no rewriting borders in Europe. I think she allowed Crimea. I could go off and we could talk about that for a while. I think that she did allow that to happen. She didn't put up enough of a fuss. But the leaders in Europe have always said, no rewriting of borders. I personally, as the presidential envoy for Kosovo and Serbia, never talked about it, never heard it. Nobody came to me and said that that was an idea.
Zotë Grenell, vazhdimisht keni kritikuar kryeministrin Kurti, sot kryeministër në atë kohë në opozitë, keni qenë një përkrahës dhe madje edhe momentalisht shprehni keqardhjen se ish presidenti Hashim Thaçi, ish lideri i UÇK-s, është në Hag. Çfarë ju bën të mendoni se Hashim Thaçi ishte një zgjidhje më e favorshme për Kosovën se sa Albin Kurti?
Look, I've negotiated between President Vučić and President Thaçi. I've negotiated between Vučić and Hoti. I've negotiated ideas between Vučić and Kurti. And I've seen what it's like for different leadership in Kosovo. And I can tell you, just from my personal experience, that Mr. Thaçi was very much looking forward and trying to solve problems. Again, there were multiple agreements. We signed 4 when I was the presidential envoy, but there were agreements before that, Brussels agreements and European agreements. I don't think that the issue right now is that we need to negotiate any more agreements. I think the issue is we need to implement the past agreements. We've sat at tables and really hard fought through issues and signed agreements. We should now implement those agreements. But I don't see Albin Kurti doing that. I see him using the legal mechanisms to say, well, I am not obligated to do that. So-and-so shouldn't have signed that agreement. Those were wrong to sign. And I just think that if we want to create economic stability, if we want to grow the economy so that young people can stay here, we've got to stop talking about these political issues and instead get back to economic cooperation. And that's one thing that I don't see from Albin Kurti. I see him talking about a lot of political issues, not economic issues. I see him rejecting economic issues and wanting to, talk about recognition. Look, this is probably a controversial statement, but I've said this in Serbia, I've said this in Kosovo, and I'll say it again here in Albania. Recognition is not going to put food on your table. Recognition is not going to get your kids to be able to stay here and have a good life. Recognition is this political issue that political people get all upset about, and I get it. But you shouldn't be asking for that. I really firmly believe that the priority right now, the priority is economic development, giving people jobs. You have a lot of people working very hard in this region, and the money that they bring home, they still can't have an amazing life. They're working all of the time, and they can't put food on the table. They don't get to travel and have a vacation after working. Look, I grew up in a family where we didn't get to take vacations on a plane. We couldn't afford it. My dad worked really, really hard, 7 days a week sometimes, and we still couldn't afford to go on vacation. I feel for the people who are being told by politicians that somehow recognition or political issues is going to change their life. It's not going to change their life. What they need are jobs. They need Western-style jobs, good-paying jobs, economic development in this region. I don't know why we're not concentrating on it.
Vetë se këtu ka një gjë se si duhet se civilizohet në Ballkan, në mënyrë veçantë në Kosovë. Zoti Grenell, në qoftë se kryeministri Kurti heq dorë nga kushti për njohje, të paktën në Ballkan, lexohet si një derë hap për të hequr dorë nga pavarësia e Kosovës. Pyetja ime për ju konkrete është: mos kushtëzimi me njohje nga Serbia i Kosovës në marrëveshje finale, a e cënon pavarësinë e fituar të Kosovës?
Look, I want to concentrate on bringing Western jobs into Kosovo so that people actually will be able to feed their family, take care of their family, and have their kids stay in this region. I'm not saying that these political issues aren't important, but they are not the priority issues. And too many times, politicians and media types keep feeding people this information that somehow the political issues have to be solved first. And all we're saying, all the Trump idea was, let's talk about jobs, let's talk about economic development, let's open the border, let's get people, commerce flowing. That's what people want. I believe that's what people want.
Patjetër, por kosovarët do të ishin të gatshëm edhe pa bukur jo të kthehen sërish poshtë Serbisë. Pyetja ime konkrete është për Richard Grenell.
I'm not suggesting that. Look, I'm not suggesting that. I believe that there should be dialogue on the political issues. What I'm saying is that it's more important. Politicians and media people should be trying to figure out how do we bring jobs and do economic development. Maybe it's in parallel, but I believe that it should be first.
Zoti Grenell, burime nga ambasada amerikane në Kosovë, për gazetarë që kemi atje dhe burime serioze, thuhet se Albin Kurtit i kanë lënë kohë të zbatoj marrëveshjet e firmosura nga parastët e tij, në veçantë asociacionin, në mos gabohem diku në mars. Në të kundërt, ata do shikojnë alternativa tjera. Alternativa tjera politike, pra brenda faktorit politik kosovar. Ju si njohës i mirë i Kosovës, njohës i mirë dhe i zotit Kurti, a besoni se Albin Kurti edhe kësaj radhe do të refuzojë amerikanët, dhe nëse po, a ka alternativa tjera politike në Kosovë të cilët mund ta mundin Kurtin me votë?
So this is what I'll say. I'm not in government anymore, so I don't know what the U.S. Embassy is saying. If that's true, I haven't heard it. I don't know about it. But what I will say is that we have many agreements talking about the association, talking about having progress in the northern part of Kosovo. We don't need any more negotiations. We need to implement the other negotiations. And that's what I think Albin Kurti is rejecting. And that's what I think is not right. He should implement the agreements that the leaders of Kosovo before him have signed. He shouldn't just reject and say, I want to start over, I want to talk about political issues. But I'll finish with this, is I wouldn't be surprised that Albin Kurti rejects any American agreements, because the reality is that he's been rejecting American agreements since Bill Clinton. And as a private citizen, he was rejecting all of the American ideas.
Gjithsesi, si qytetare ka drejtat e tij, si kryeminist ka angazhime ndaj popullit të Kosovës, por ju dëgjoj që flisni jo vetëm ju, por të gjithë, në fakt, gjithë zërin.
Can I respond to that? Of course he has his rights. He has every right to have his voice and to have his own opinion. But then he also has to live with the reputation that he keeps rejecting American ideas. And that's all I'm saying. You don't get to say that you are embracing American ideas if you're rejecting all of the American ideas. Just own it. Just say, there hasn't been an American idea that I've accepted. And that's what his position is.
Vetëm se ka një gjë, në qoftë se Kurti nuk po zbaton 2 marrëveshje, ose një më saktë, Serbia dhe Vučić nuk po zbaton shumë marrëveshje të firmosura. Ajo duket se ka një presion të njëanshëm vetëm ndaj zotit Kurti, si pala më e dobës Kosova, dhe nuk ka presion ndaj Serbisë të zbatojë marrëveshjet e firmosura.
No. We pressure Serbia all the time to implement agreements. We pressure them to think through any action that they take, that these are serious issues. We pressure constantly to say, think about economic issues, or I should say, we've pressured them when I was in the government. Now that I'm not in the government, I get to just have a role of talking about economic development even more so than I have been.
Me që jemi të zhvillimi ekonomik, ka një plan franco-gjerman të publikuar. A është një orë me të Richard Grenell, sa të mundur e shikon zbatimin apo arritjen e marrëveshjes bazë të këtij plani dhe nëse po, sa e normalizon marrëdhëniet Serbi-Kosovë ky plan?
Look, I've seen a little parts of this French-German plan, and again, I go back to the fact we don't need any new plans. We've got some really great agreements. We would have incredible progress if both sides would implement those agreements. So I just think that we need to go back and implement the previous agreements. And the last point on the Franco-German ideas is that it's very general. It's not specific. So it's just kind of a overall theory of, we should work together. But it seems to me that it's an overall theory that just points back to the previous agreements. And that's what we have to do, is we have to implement the previous hard-fought, negotiated, signed agreements.
Të nënshkruara dhe zbatuara. Kur fliset për këto marrëveshje të negociuara të nënshkruara që sillen zhvillim ekonomik në mënyrë veçantë, një marrëveshje që ka në bazë ekonominë është marrëveshja që shohet në vitin 2020 në zyrën e presidentit Trump, ndërmjet kryeministrit Hoti dhe presidentit Vučić. Kjo marrëveshje e firmosur nga presidenti SBA-ve. Në gjykimin tuaj ekziston si marrëveshje e zbatueshme apo administrata Trump nuk e konsideron? Administrata Biden nuk e konsideron?
No, I believe you can check with the U.S. Embassy. Again, I'm not working in government, but they've embraced it. They have embraced these, and they call them the Washington Agreements, and that they recognize that these were good agreements, and they're calling for their implementation. They're not rejecting them.
Por gjithsesi garantuesi ishte zyra e presidentit Trump, zbatuesit është Serbia dhe Kosova. A ka një presion aktual nga qeveria amerikane për ta zbatuar këtë marrëveshje?
Look, I reject that, because this again is these political things that political people try to do, is to say, oh, well, who's the guarantee? Look, nothing is ever going to get done in the Balkans unless there's political will from the countries, right? You're not going to force people to do things. You're not going to force the governments to do things that they don't want to do. What I negotiated was an agreement that both sides said, yep, we agree with these points. All the United States' role was to do was to push them to say, think about these in a different light. Let's give and take. And both sides signed saying, we will implement these points because we agree with them. We may not like them, but we agree that they're going to get us to economic normalization. I do think that one of the problems with governments in the Balkan region is that they're looking for this hammer to come down and tell them what to do and to have some sort of a legal or a guarantee from the Europeans or from the Americans. You all have to do it yourself. You have to figure out what's best for your country, and there is give and take there. And then you can sign agreements and to move forward. Don't expect other people to somehow implement or enforce those agreements. You have to do it yourself if you believe in the agreements.
Zotë Grenell, kjo që thonë ju është krejt korrekte, por po flasim për një rajon që ka prodhuar 2 luftra ballkanike dhe 2 luftra botërore. Dhe vetëm bombat e NATO-s kanë sjellë stabilitet të vend. Po të ishte për vullnetin e vendit Ballkanit, ky vend fatkeqësisht, ky rajon, pa ndërhyrje të fortë, pa tutor, ka treguar se kurrë nuk do të ketë stabilitet. Prandaj të gjitha pyetjet janë në këtë kontekst. Ajo çfarë thonë ju është e drejtë, por Ballkani është Ballkan.
Look, I agree that the history is difficult. I'm somebody who, when I come here, though, I see young people who want to move on, who want to look to the future, who want to create jobs and a great economy. And I don't see people, regular young people, wanting to be stuck in the past. I do see the media, and I do see politicians constantly bringing it up and talking about how difficult it is. And I don't think that that's smart, because I think there's going to be a moment where the young people completely reject what's happening because they want to move on and they want to look forward. I'm much more hopeful, I think, than you. I believe that the young people want to look to the future, and they don't want to just fight about the past. But again, you know, I recognize that I didn't grow up here, and that the emotions are incredibly difficult to just reject. But I believe that another generation, the younger generation, which has heard the stories and certainly see the emotion from their family, are beginning to say, it's not worth it. I want to move forward, and I want to have some sort of a future where my family gets to stay here. And that's what I want to be the cheerleader for, is the future, and try to, as much as possible, convince people that America, the West, needs to have a fantastic relationship with the Balkans.
A e duket se ka një ndryshim ndërmjet politikës amerikane dhe asaj europiane sa i përket krizës Kosovës me Serbinë. Dje Parlamenti Evropian ka miratuar një rezolutë ku i kërkon Serbisë njëjën reciproke me Kosovën në mënyrë konkrete dhe këshillon Serbinë të vendosë sanksionet ndaj Ukrainës, në të kundërt rruga saj drejt Brukselit stopon. Ka një ndryshim ndërmjet politikës amerikane dhe asaj europiane për sa i përket konfliktit Kosovë-Serbi?
Well, I don't work for the U.S. government, so you could ask the American embassy. I will tell you this, though, that there is a difference in U.S. and EU policy in that we like to get stuff done. I don't want to just talk. I don't want to just have a meeting and delay this, you know, process for years and decades and promise people that something is happening and then not do it. That's just not my personality. And I don't think it was Donald Trump's personality, which is why we took the lead and we said we're going to bring the parties together and we're going to come up with ideas and we're going to push forward ideas. We're not going to sit around and talk about politics for another 50 years. And so that was our position. The current position of the Biden White House, though, is to not have America take the lead, but to have the Europeans take the lead. And so that's why you see Americans waiting on the Europeans, and we're back to lots of talk and not a lot of action.
Ndërkohë, Kina vazhdon të zgjerohet në Ballkan. Zoti Grenell, është luks për një gazetar t'ju intervistoj, pasi jo vetëm si në analizat tuaja, por si një ish diplomat keni qenë gjithmonë drejt për drejt, prandaj përgjigjet tuaja në fakt ja japin mundësinë gazetarit të thellohet në pyetje. Turqi, Shqipëri, Serbi, Erdogan, Rama, Vučić. Sigurisht ju flisni për një nevojë të bashkëpunimit rajonal që të shuaj konfliktet e mëparshme. Kryeministri shqiptar gjithmonë është justifikues për presidentin serb dhe akuzues për kryeministrin e Kosovës Kurti. Ndërkohë, duket se rëndësia e Turqisë në rajon, edhe për SBA dhe për Europën, i kanë lënë dorë të lirë që në këtë vend të krijohen 3 autokraci që kanë cënuar demokracinë në funksion të stabilitetit. A shpenduar perëndimi për demokracinë ballkanese? Mos ka një moment që perëndimorët janë bindur ky vend nuk i rri demokracia dhe kemi nevojë për stabilitet. Pra, pa dashur, apo ndihmon perëndimin në instalimin e autokracive në vend të demokracisë në Ballkan?
Look, the luxury that I have of not being in the government is that I get to be free of all this conflict, right? This political conflict. It's interesting, and we can talk about it for a while. So I don't want to critique what's happening right now between the countries. But let me say this. Let me say a couple of things. One, I believe that people deserve democracy. And I believe that everybody should have it. You don't have to earn it, but it's a God-given right. God gives you your right to have your voice. And I've learned over the years that it's not the American style of democracy that's the right way. Everybody has a little bit different flavor. And that local flavor, I think, is important. And so I'm going to continue pushing Balkan countries from the private sector to act more like democracies. I don't think that countries in this region should be doing business with Russia or China. I believe in America, and I would constantly try to have American ideas and American options, whether it's in commerce, energy, whatever the issue. I want to see Americans have ideas that put forward and have the Balkan leaders have greater trade and closer relationship with the United States. Not that the United States is perfect. I certainly know that. But I think that what we do perfectly is constantly think about how to be better. We're constantly critiquing ourselves. And so the system is a perfect system. The outcome is not perfect. And what I mean by that is luckily we have enough freedom where regular people can stand up and say, this doesn't work. This isn't good. Let's fix it. And when Americans concentrate on fixing a problem, we usually fix it.
Urojmë që Amerikanët përqendrohen për të stabilizuar demokracinë në Ballkan, që momentalisht është kthyer në autokraci. Zoti Grenell, unë të falenderoj shumë dhe pyetja ime e fundit për ju është kur do ktheheni sërish në Ballkan?
Well, I've been coming regularly. I don't have specific dates yet, but I will absolutely be back. I love the people. I have many friends here now, and it's part of my job to bring investment into the Balkans, so I'm excited about that.
Të falenderoj shumë. Kjo ka qenë intervista me Richard Grenell. Do të kemi një hapësirë publicitare dhe pastaj do të ndjekim një material shumë interesant mbi protestën e parë antikomuniste për rrëzimin e busit të Stalinit në Shkodër me 14 janar 1990. Në fakt është një ngjarje pothuajse e mbajtur e heshtur, por është shkëndija e parë e kthimit të pluralizmit në Shqipëri. Bëhet fjalë për 14 janar 1990, tentativa për të rrëzuar busin e Stalinit në Shkodër. Bashk, natë mirë.